Welcome to a deep dive, into Mark Manson's The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck.
Oh, yeah.
It's, the title might sound a little provocative to some people,
Yeah,
but, this book is full of wisdom,
absolutely.
tough love.
Yeah, definitely challenges conventional thinking about happiness and success. He's
Yeah.
not afraid to use blunt language, and that's what makes it so refreshing,
So right from the start, he throws us a curveball by introducing Charles Bukowski.
right?
And Bukowski is a poet,
Yes.
known for his gritty depictions of life.
Um,
It's not your typical self-help intro, but there's a method to Manson's madness.
Absolutely. By showcasing Bukowski's unconventional path to success,
Right.
Manson sets the stage for his central argument.
Okay.
That society's obsession with positivity and achievement is actually a recipe for anxiety and unhappiness.
So he has this term for it.
Yeah.
The feedback loop from hell.
Yes.
And basically what he's saying is we get so caught up in feeling bad about feeling bad that we end up amplifying our suffering.
Think about it. We worry about being anxious.
Right.
We feel guilty for not being more productive,
Oh,
and then beat ourselves up for not being happy enough.
yeah.
It's exhausting.
It's a lot. So where does not giving a fuck come in?
Yeah.
Is Manson advocating for apathy
Not at all.
or nihilism?
No, he's advocating for the opposite, a more conscious and deliberate approach to caring.
Yeah.
The key is not to stop giving a fuck altogether,
Okay.
but to be more selective about what we choose to give a fuck about.
So it's about prioritizing our values
Exactly.
and letting go of the things that don't truly matter.
Yes, Manson argues that when we try to give a fuck about everything, we end up giving a fuck about nothing.
Right.
It's like diluting our energy and attention across too many things, leaving us feeling scattered and unfulfilled.
Okay, that makes sense.
Mhm.
But how do we determine what's actually worth giving a fuck about?
Right.
Because it's easy to get caught up in the shoulds and the have-tos that society throws at us.
That's where Chapter 3 comes in. Happiness is a problem. Manson introduces this character called Disappointment Panda,
Right.
who forces us to confront uncomfortable truths.
I was skeptical about the whole disappointment panda thing at first,
Yeah.
but I have to admit it's a pretty effective way to drive home the point
Right.
that sometimes we need a dose of reality.
Yes. One of the key truths that Disappointment Panda helps us confront is that negative emotions aren't inherently bad.
Okay.
They can be valuable feedback mechanisms.
Like warning lights on your car dashboard.
Exactly.
They might be annoying, but they're letting you know that something needs attention.
Exactly. Manson uses the example of physical pain.
Okay.
If you stub your toe, the pain tells you to be more careful next time.
Right.
Emotional pain can signal that something in our lives needs to change.
So it's not about suppressing or avoiding negative emotions.
Right.
It's about understanding what they're trying to tell us.
Precisely. Manson argues that happiness isn't about avoiding problems altogether. It's about solving problems that are aligned with our values,
Okay.
that contribute to our overall well-being.
So he makes this distinction between good problems and bad problems.
Yes.
Can you elaborate on that a bit more?
Sure. He gives the example of a woman who obsesses over a 30-cent coupon while her life is falling apart around her.
Wow.
That's a bad problem
Okay.
because it's not actually addressing the real issues that she's facing.
It's like rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic.
Exactly.
Makes you feel better temporarily, but doesn't solve the bigger problem.
And Manson contrasts this with the story of a prince who seeks out suffering, thinking it holds the key to enlightenment, only to realize that suffering in itself is pointless.
Right.
It's about finding the right problems to solve the ones that are aligned with our values and lead to genuine growth.
Okay. So it's not about avoiding problems altogether.
Right.
It's about choosing our battles wisely.
Exactly.
Which brings us to Chapter 5. You are not special. And this seems to be particularly relevant in today's culture of social media and constant self-promotion.
Definitely, Manson challenges the notion of entitlement and the idea that we are all destined for greatness. He argues that this kind of thinking actually leads to more unhappiness because it sets us up for disappointment.
He uses a character to illustrate this point.
Mhm.
Jimmy, the wannabe entrepreneur who's all talk and no action.
Right, Jimmy's a classic example of someone who's bought into the hype of exceptionalism without putting in the work to back it up.
He's got this inflated sense of self-importance, no real substance.
Right.
And it's interesting because Manson also shares his own struggles with entitlement, particularly in relationships.
Yeah.
He talks about how his childhood experiences, specifically a traumatic incident in middle school where he was wrongly accused of bringing drugs to school, led him to seek validation and acceptance in unhealthy ways. He describes two extremes of entitlement in relationships.
Okay.
either expecting others to take responsibility for our problems or taking on too much responsibility for other people's problems.
The classic victim-savior dynamic.
And he connects this to the rise of victimhood chic,
Right.
where people claim victim status as a way to garner attention and sympathy. He makes an important distinction between genuine victims and those who use victimhood as a way to avoid personal responsibility.
It's a delicate subject, but it's crucial to have this conversation.
Right.
Because true empowerment comes from taking ownership of our choices and actions, even when we've been dealt a difficult hand.
So it's not about denying our pain or minimizing our experiences.
Right.
It's about recognizing that we always have a choice in how we respond to those experiences.
Exactly. And that choice is what ultimately determines our level of freedom and happiness.
I'm starting to see how not giving a fuck is actually about taking more responsibility for our lives.
Yes.
Not less.
It's about shifting our focus from external validation to internal validation, from chasing fleeting pleasures to pursuing meaningful values.
Manson uses this powerful example from history to illustrate the dangers of clinging to a flawed value system.
Okay.
Hiru Onoda, the Japanese soldier who continued fighting World War II for decades after it ended.
Onoda's story is both tragic and fascinating. He dedicated himself to a cause that no longer existed, refusing to surrender, even when presented with overwhelming evidence that the war was over.
Wow. It's like he was so caught up in his own narrative, his own sense of duty,
Yes.
that he couldn't accept reality.
And this is where the subtle art of not giving a fuck comes in.
Okay.
It's about having the courage to question our values, to reassess our priorities, and to let go of beliefs that no longer serve us.
Even if it means challenging deeply ingrained beliefs or going against the grain of society.
Exactly. It's about defining what success means for you, not for someone else.
That's a lot to think about.
Yes, it is.
We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be back to explore the concept of values in more detail.
Sounds good.
Stay with us.
Ready to jump back in.
Yeah, let's pick up where we left off.
So we were talking about values.
Right, values. It feels like we've been dancing around this concept, and I'm eager to get to the heart of it. Chapter 6, Values, seems like the perfect place to start.
Yeah, this is where Manson lays out his framework for choosing better values and values that lead to a more fulfilling and meaningful life.
And he uses some pretty compelling examples to illustrate this point, from his own personal experience with his brother to the stories of musicians like Dave Mustaine and Pete Best.
What I find fascinating is how he shows that our values determine the metrics by which we measure our lives. It's like we have a built-in compass that guides our decisions and actions, whether we're consciously aware of it or not.
So if our compass is pointed in the wrong direction, we could end up chasing the wrong things, even if they look like success on the surface.
Exactly. And Manson uses Dave Mustaine, the former guitarist for Metallica, to illustrate this point.
Right.
Mustaine achieved massive success by most people's standards, but he still felt like a failure.
Yeah, because he was constantly comparing himself to Metallica's success.
Right.
So his metric for success was tied to their achievements.
Exactly.
So no matter how well Megadeth did, it never felt like enough.
It's like he was stuck in this perpetual cycle of not good enough, even though he was objectively successful.
Right.
And this highlights the importance of choosing values that are internally driven rather than externally driven.
So it's not about achieving a certain level of fame, fortune, or recognition. It's about living in alignment with our own personal values.
Exactly.
And Manson contrasts this with the story of Pete Best, the original drummer for the Beatles, who was fired right before they made it big.
Yeah, Pete Best's story is a testament to the power of choosing the right metrics for success.
Right.
Despite being dealt what many would consider a devastating blow, he ended up finding happiness and fulfillment in a way that Mustaine, with all his fame and fortune, never did.
Because he chose to define success on his own terms.
Exactly.
Family and a simple life became his new measure.
And it brings us back to Manson's central argument. Choosing better values leads to better problems, which ultimately leads to a better life.
It's not about avoiding problems altogether, remember?
Right. Happiness is a problem.
It's about choosing problems that are aligned with what truly matters to us.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's not the absence of problems, but the quality of problems that defines a fulfilling life.
Exactly.
This leads us to Chapter 4, Responsibility, which delves deeper into this idea of choice and control.
Okay.
And Manson gets really personal here, sharing more about his past and how it shaped his views on responsibility.
He circles back to the traumatic experience with the middle school principal where he was wrongly accused of bringing drugs to school and talks about how the lack of open communication in his family led him to develop unhealthy coping mechanisms in relationships.
It's like he was swinging between two extremes, either expecting partners to solve his problems or trying to solve all their problems for them.
Yeah, the classic victim-savior dynamic, as we mentioned earlier.
Right. And it's a trap that I think a lot of us fall into.
Yeah.
But Manson makes this crucial distinction between responsibility and fault.
Right.
He argues that even when we're not at fault for our circumstances, we're still responsible for how we respond to them.
Right.
It's that classic saying, life is 10% what happens to you and 90% how you react to it.
Exactly.
We can't always control what happens to us, but we can control how we choose to interpret and respond to those events.
Exactly. And that's where the do something principle comes in. It's such a simple yet powerful idea.
Right?
Take action even if you don't feel motivated, and the motivation will often follow.
I love that principle.
Yeah.
It's so easy to get stuck in analysis paralysis, overthinking everything, and never actually taking action. But Manson's basically saying, just do something, anything, and see where it leads you.
It's about breaking out of that cycle of inertia and embracing the power of action.
Right. And this leads us to one of the most, I think, thought-provoking chapters in the book, Chapter 9. And then you die.
Yeah.
This is where Manson gets really existential, exploring the big questions of life, death, and legacy.
Yeah, he starts with a really poignant story about his friend Josh, who tragically died in a cliff diving accident. And Josh's death was a wake-up call for Manson, forcing him to confront his own fear of living and embrace the present moment.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that life is precious and unpredictable, and we don't know how much time we have.
He talks about how before Josh's death, he was this, typical stoner kid, lazy, unmotivated, filled with anxiety. But Josh's passing jolted him awake, stripping away the illusion of endless tomorrows and highlighting the urgency of living fully today.
And this ties into the work of Ernest Becker, the cultural anthropologist, who wrote extensively about death anxiety and its impact on human behavior. His concept of immortality projects really struck a chord with me. The idea that we're driven to create lasting legacies to compensate for our fear of death.
Right. That makes sense. We build careers, accumulate possessions, strive for recognition, all in an effort to leave our mark on the world and transcend our own mortality.
Exactly. And Manson connects this to the idea that true greatness comes from choosing our values, not from achieving these external markers of success.
So it's not about denying death or trying to outrun it. It's about using our awareness of death as a catalyst for living more intentionally.
Yes. It's about asking ourselves, what will be my legacy? What do I want to be remembered for?
Right. And this brings us back to the subtle art of not giving a fuck. It's about consciously choosing what matters, accepting the inevitable imperfections of life, and facing our fears head on.
It's about recognizing that we are all going to die, and that this realization, while perhaps unsettling, can actually be a source of liberation.
Right.
It frees us from the tyranny of chasing external validation and allows us to live on our own terms, embracing the preciousness of the present moment and leaving a legacy that reflects our truest selves. Manson shares a really interesting story, actually, about confronting his fear of heights by standing on the edge of a cliff at the Cape of Good Hope.
Oh, wow.
He talks about this internal struggle, this magnet pulling him back from the edge, but also the exhilaration of overcoming that fear.
It's like a metaphor for, facing our fears, stepping outside our comfort zones, choosing to live a life of intention and purpose, even in the face of, uncertainty and death.
And that's the paradox, isn't it? By accepting our mortality, we actually become more free to live fully in the present moment. We let go of the need to control everything and embrace the beauty and the fragility of life.
This has been such an insightful conversation. I'm really starting to see how not giving a fuck is actually about caring more deeply about the things that truly matter.
It's about choosing our values, setting healthy boundaries, and focusing our energy on what aligns with our deepest selves.
Right. And accepting that life will involve pain, disappointment, and loss.
Exactly.
But instead of being paralyzed by these experiences, we can choose to learn from them.
Grow from them.
And ultimately use them to create a more meaningful and fulfilling life.
So to wrap things up, perhaps the most fuck-worthy thing of all is living a life true to ourselves on our own terms, even if it means facing uncomfortable truths and making difficult choices.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the subtle art of not giving a fuck.
We hope you found it insightful and, dare we say, enlightening.
And until next time, keep choosing your fucks wisely.
Yes, choose them wisely.